It's still hot there? Okay. All right. Thank you and welcome to this edition of the Alumni Talks. My name is Ali Khan. I'm the Dean of the Mushtaq Ahmad Gurmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences. And it's an enormous pleasure for me to welcome again Saba Karim Khan. And of course, we're going to talk about the relationship that we have, and we're going to talk about her career as well. But I'm just going to read quickly a short blurb on Saba before we go into the questions. Saba Karim Khan is an author, award-winning filmmaker and educator whose writing has appeared in The Guardian, The Independent, Wasafiri, HuffPost, Verso, Think Progress, Dawn, The Friday Times, and The Express Tribune. Her debut novel, Skyfall, was published by Bloomsbury, and her documentary film, Concrete Dream, Some Roads Lead Home, produced by the Doha Film Institute, won the Excellence Award at the Documentaries Without Borders Film Festival, USA, Best Documentary Award at the Indian World Film Festival, the Tagore International Film Festival, and the Calcutta International Cult Film Festival, and was officially selected at the France-based Beyond the Curve International Film Festival. Saba is a Mushtaq Ahmad Gurmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences alumni back in 2006 and a Dean's Honor List awardee. She is also a recipient of the LUMS Vice Chancellor's Alumni Achievement Award. She has read social anthropology at the University of Oxford and works at the New York University Abu Dhabi Social Research and Public Policy Department within the Social Science Division. Before joining the academy, she worked as country marketing and public affairs head at Citigroup. So lots of achievements in a short space of time. Saba, thank you for being with us. And I'm going to really start at the beginning because I thought it was kind of interesting to know, before you came to LUMS, if you could tell us a little bit about your schooling and your life in Karachi, a bit about the family as well, so that we can get to know some of the influences that led you to LUMS.
Yeah, no, well, thank you so much. This is an absolute honor, and I know what your own schedule is like. So, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. Who better to have this conversation with than you? But yeah, I think that's a great place to start. So, I was coming to LUMS from Karachi Grammar School. And I grew up in Karachi. My formative years were there, and I was at KGS since nursery. So, really, barring Montessori until the age of 3 or 4, I'd known no other school. And so I spent my years growing up there. I grew up in a home where my father was a professor of English literature, and so it was kind of a home where we would talk at the dining table right from Shakespeare to Ghalib to everything in between. And I suppose KGS was a glorious experience, and it was very illuminating. It was obviously very prestigious to have done my schooling there. But I guess it was also, and LUMS kind of put this into sharper focus for me, that I guess it was a little bit limiting. And I think what I mean by that is that we were interacting and meeting largely with a very homogenous group of people from very similar backgrounds. Not entirely, but to a large extent, everyone was sort of from privilege and, from a certain pedigree, a certain affluence. And so, in that sense, I think my siblings and I were a bit of a misfit. So, that's not to take away the fact that KGS has contributed largely, but to say that there was this really jarring kind of distance or cleavage between kind of our home and the school in that sense, because Abu was constantly teaching us money can't buy you happiness, at least after a certain point. And I suppose this backstory is important because you realize that as a kid, as a child, that kind of class disparity can be quite scarring. And so for me, LUMS, the thought of coming to LUMS was obviously a huge deal. And, we'll get into that later. But it was the first educational institute that really shifted that around in my mind and, kind of exposed me to a side of Pakistan, to the kind of versatility and the range of backgrounds that I didn't quite see otherwise during my school time. But apart from that, it was wonderful. I think for us, books and a range of music, ghazals, all of that was very staple in our family. That's what we grew up around. Storytelling was a real staple. So I spent most of my Saturdays at the British Council Library in Karachi. And yeah, I think that's really what the formative years were like.
So, I mean, Saba, you've already in this short introduction, you've mentioned your father twice, and clearly he was a huge influence on you and your siblings. And the home environment obviously had a huge impact. So I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about him and how that sort of molded your interests.
Yeah, well, how long do we have? Because I feel like I'm always like craving when I still remember back at LUMS, I was interviewing with Unilever, and out of nowhere, because that was a very hardcore corporate interview, and out of nowhere, the recruiter said, father-daughter relationship, like talk to me about that. And it was, so as you know very well, that's special to me. As I was saying, Sir Abu was a professor of English literature, but he sort of would always talk to us about the importance of being rooted in Urdu along with English, even though he taught English. So I think that's something which I went on later at LUMS also to study and kind of, I think he would always say the hallmark of someone truly educated is having a grip over both of the languages. But I think he was an idealist to a fault. And some of those things I recognize retrospectively more. Everything I've even said to you about schooling, where I realize, well, money does have a role to play, and it does, financial security does have a role to play. So it's not as if you can completely discard that. But I think out of a lot of things that Abu kind of conditioned us and primed us towards, there were a couple of things that really struck out. And one of these things I've said in the dedication in the book, which is that he always taught us to see the glass half full. I think God knows we can do with that, especially coming off of the pandemic and all of that, and just making us, like, he'd always say, Mayusi guna hai, like, so don't, it's not as if life doesn't get hard, but kind of trying to keep your eye on that movement towards light. And the other big thing I think that he really stressed was humility, and this idea of just kind of being comfortable in your skin and just being humble, and something that I think one doesn't see as much today. But so I think those were two things. Additionally, he's been a really big influence because he would always talk to us about these three books that he wanted to write in his life and that he'd scripted in his head. One of them was titled The Road Not Taken, inspired by Robert Frost's poem. And so I think when Skyfall was published and when the novel came out, I just felt like it was just a really small fulfillment of a really big dream that he carried. And that unfortunately, and this breaks my heart, but unfortunately, he couldn't fulfill for a number of reasons. And so I remember the day that, on publication day, once it was all out and, Bloomsbury had done their social media and everything was out in the open, I called up my mother, and neither of us exchanged, no words were exchanged, but, we just both completely broke down. And I think that was just because it invoked such nostalgia for Abu. So I think that is really, it's a very emotionally laden conversation, but I think he's very indispensable to not just my journey, but that of my siblings as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's for those of us who are fortunate enough to have parents who were so invested in their children and interested and really did guide one. It's an incredible connection that you have. But so let's move a little bit on now. I mean, you talked about KGS, and I'm just wondering now. You sort of hinted at how different LUMS was, and I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about on how when you got to LUMS, how it was different, and did it take you a lot of time to settle in? Of course, it was a much smaller place then, so maybe a little bit about what LUMS was like and when you joined and some of the challenges that you faced or maybe didn't face.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. Well, even before I got to LUMS, sort of physically, the decision was a really big one. As I know, and I know, especially if current students are listening, it's important to sort of share that vulnerability and share the kind of the real journey, really, if you will. And for my family, it was a really big decision on two counts. My brother had come the year before, so that was our first kind of segue into the university. And ever since he went, I was like, this was kind of my bucket list more than that, just to say like life would really be fulfilled if I got to LUMS. But it was big on two counts. One was because I needed the scholarship. And so in July, when LUMS asked me to moderate the telethon, the Give a Day to LUMS telethon with, people like Sayyid Babar Ali Saab, etc., I spoke from my heart because I just felt like people often don't realize this on the giving end, but the scholarship can really be a life-changing moment for a lot of people coming in. So for me, the real decision was when the scholarship came through, because I think without that, it would have been impossible, not difficult, but impossible. Secondly, also because as much as one might say that we came from a family of letters and, education, and we were so enlightened, apparently, but it was still a big decision to let a girl go. And I saw that, I think, in the decision that there was for my brother versus me. And I think in large part, it took his coaxing really to my parents to say it's all right to let a girl leave the city, go live in a hostel, all of that stuff. But anyway, the more sort of illuminating and the funner part was, and this is why I referenced the KGS piece, that you enter LUMS, and I feel like something quite astonishing happens, especially when you have a point of reference where you're coming from, say, KGS. And it's almost as if all of those barriers, those social constructs of what's your last name, are you on a scholarship, all of that slowly starts to shed away. And I think for me, that was extremely transformational. And it's something that has really stayed with me, where you realize that you're with a bunch of like-minded people from different ethnicities, from different class backgrounds. You're in class with taking courses with NOP scholars. So it's everybody kind of in this potpourri of this delicious mix. And that was the first time that I realized Pakistan itself is this beautiful kaleidoscope, where you've got a range of people who, are speaking a ton of languages, both literally and metaphorically. And I think it just made me realize that LUMS has really, at least at that time, had very successfully managed to cultivate an environment that was quite insular from this class consciousness and from all of these other things. And it was a leveler in some ways, and I think that lent me a lot of perspective. It was very real and grounded, for lack of a better expression. And the network that I formed there is one that has stayed with me, as it has for, we were at the Vice Chancellor's Alumni Awards earlier in the summer. Everybody was talking about that, wherever you might be in the world, but if you meet a Luminite, you don't have to explain yourself. You're starting up. So I think whether it's professionally, whether it's socially, that network really stays with you. But coming to your point about challenges and coming to your point about just settling in kind of on a more practical level, I think it was bloody hard in the sense that I remember sitting in the common room. This was before the semester had started. And I was, we used to have those big PC monitor computers at the time. And gosh, I feel ancient. I didn't have a laptop at the time. And I was bawling my eyes out, feeling like, why did I do this to myself? Because it felt isolating. It was the first time I'd left Karachi, I'd left home. But very, very quickly, I think you just kind of take to it, you adjust. And I guess the one thing that I do want to say is that the rigor of LUMS, which at the time it was difficult to appreciate why that demand was there, the nighters, the fact that somebody would say, pull together a presentation in like half an hour. I have this distinct memory of a communication skills, a comm skills class. This wonderful teacher whose name I'm forgetting now. And she said, you have a minute, step out of the class and prepare this speech, pick out the chit from a little fishbowl, go out and prepare a speech and come back and speak for a minute, just impromptu. And I kid you not, sir, at that moment, I'd like to believe I'm pretty confident otherwise, but in that moment, I just wanted to run and go drop the course. I was like, I can't do this, you know? But eventually, cut to like, you know, graduation and all of that, and you realize it sets a certain benchmark and a certain quality control which makes you competitive in any part of the world. And you know, I'm one of many people who's gone on to then study at places like Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, wherever that might be, and you realize you're not overawed. So in that strange way, it becomes a passport to enter these otherwise pretty impermissible domains, and those doors open. So I think that was really my experience.
Yeah, well, it's wonderful to hear that. I think, and to understand the challenges that every person coming into a university faces, and how you overcome it. I wanted to also ask you a little bit about the academic side of being at LUMS, and how it might have opened up certain avenues, because I mean, here you are, someone who's interested in English, probably other things as well. Did LUMS offer you the opportunities to sort of explore and be excited in terms of how you grew as a person yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think any talk about my journey, much like probably others, it's very hard to disentangle the contribution that LUMS has. And what I mean by that is not just, oh, it was a great place, which we know, but it's just indispensable academically as well. So if I back up a little bit, I entered LUMS with supreme clarity that I was going to do what at that time was a social science major. And I think now there are more sort of crystallized streams and it's more specialized, but at that time, kind of anthropology, philosophy, sociology, everything got subsumed under the ambit of the SS degree. And it wasn't one that was taken very seriously. It was the kind of degree that people were like, by students, I mean, so it's kind of this, and the parents of students, I would say, because there was this kind of perception that if you didn't have anything else, you were failing at everything else, SS would be your lovely little contingency plan. I was one of the few people who, perhaps like we were saying, because of, the home background and everything else, I knew this is what I wanted to do. And it has just been so transformational. I could say a bunch of things, but I'm going to limit it to two key skills that I think SS lent for me. Again, so I was coming from this completely British curriculum of schooling, where KGS trained us, much like most other schools in Pakistan, to take an exam, go through the past papers, kind of you need to get straight A's, then you need to get to all of that stuff. And cut to LUMS, and you suddenly realize it was the first time somebody was emphasizing learning and knowledge production. And somebody was saying, well, I'm not going to drum down this learning with a hammer, but I'll show you a picture, respond to it. I'll teach you a class on, as you did, on magic, witchcraft, things you couldn't have imagined you'd be learning in Pakistan, And it wasn't all to the tune of saying, well, you've got to get a 4.0 GPA, It was to say, well, learn along the way. And I think any and everything that I've actually distilled academically has been from LUMS. Like, there's no denying that. And speaking of skills, I think the SS program, it gave me critical thinking and it gave me analytical skills. And I just feel it doesn't matter what job you do after graduation, but there's no getting away from critical thinking and from analytical skills. Like, I think these are two things that serve you so well in life. It was the first time somebody was saying, don't passively accept information that's being thrown at you. Question it, like wrestle with the data, interrogate it, And I have to say, forget professionally, but even personally today with social media and stuff, there's so much clutter, so much is being thrown at you. And every time I look at it now, I'm kind of looking at it with this kind of critical lens to say, all right, kind of what's gone into the making of it. And I think in Pakistan, you're just not taught that enough. Especially as a girl, you're taught more to kind of passively just accept what's coming your way. So I feel like, in that sense, it really helped me discover my voice. And so much of what I've done, like what I've written for The Guardian, what's gone into the book, what's gone into the film, is this sense of look at people in life in 3D and don't flatten out any category of people. That's what the SS degree taught me. Like, don't try and stuff people in cookie cutters, but rather kind of strip them out. And if I may just really quickly say one other thing that LUMS and this particular degree taught me very, very powerfully was how do you sit in a space and agree to disagree with someone without never being able to look at them in the face again? And I think it's important. I mean, this is something I realize even more through life because Pakistani politics is such a good example that today you're thinking there are people who are unable to actually come to that conversation without, kind of with any shred of civility. And I remember sitting in class so many times thinking like, oh gosh, there someone goes again, or someone else probably feeling that about me, but just the ability to say what is their vantage point that has brought them to this. And I think we can do with a lot more of that. So yeah, the SS
Definitely.
degree,
Definitely.
like,
So I'm going to jump forward a little bit because I want to come back to something in a while. But so having done this ostensibly useless degree in the social sciences, you then went ahead and got a job at Citibank.
yeah.
And I just wanted to know, so how did that work out? I mean, firstly, did you want to go there? And secondly, you know, what sort of led to Citibank saying, yes, we'd like to have this person on board? And you stayed for a while. So maybe a little bit about that.
Thank you for asking me that, because quite honestly, I think about this so much. I think it's not a myth to say that a lot of our milieu and our social conditioning, even our parents, right? Like, I mean, my father might have been an exception because he was pursuing literature himself, but for most people, there is this question of, well, is it a bankable career? Like, is it a bankable degree? Is it lucrative? Are you A, going to get a job? B, will it make you money? All of those very important, pre-existential questions. And so for me, it was interesting because I ended up at Citi, um, by fluke. And I think that's important to acknowledge, and I'll explain to you why in a minute. That Citi had come to the LUMS campus to recruit, just like a ton of other recruiters, and I was like, no way! Like I was coming from this mindset of I want to change the world in much more meaningful ways, and a corporate job will never get you that. It's sort of people who are after just the money and this, that, the other. And it was funnily my mother who said, just I mean, go do the interview. It'll, if nothing else, it'll give you the interviewing practice. And I think there's some credit and there's some credence to that kind of logic as well, to say, because you will have to interview for a ton of places. So I remember I interviewed with Citibank, and the first interview was funnily the night after the farewell, and I'm thinking, why am I doing this to myself? I want to just sleep. I'm almost graduating. Went and did it. It was a very aggressive interview. They interrogated me like to the hilt. And I came out, called my mother, and said, why did you do this to me? I knew it was going to go down badly. I don't want to work for a corporation. Somehow ended up getting shortlisted after a couple of rounds for the final interview. The final interview was the same day I'd gone and interviewed for Unilever. They'd flown me to Karachi. And so I came back half an hour after I landed. I had to interview for Citibank's final round. Again, had these real existential questions of जब करनी नहीं है वो job तो क्यों मैं जा रही हूँ interview के लिए? And the reason why I'm kind of hammering this part of the story is I ended up getting the job. Funnily worked at Citibank twice in my life, as you know, and just loved it. And I think it's important to emphasize that on two grounds. One is to say that people, even back in 2006, had stopped hiring purely on the basis of the degree that you were doing. I think a lot of people still feel like, oh, no, I'm going to do sociology. What will that do for me? Like, how do I go and sell myself if it's not economics, if it's not accounting? And I think there are reports from places like McKinsey and P&G now, which will back what I'm saying, that it's no longer, unless it's a vocational job that requires that particular technical know-how, people are now hiring you much more on the basis of, kind of, it's on the basis of your skills, which is why I spoke about critical thinking and I spoke about analytical thinking and analytical skills and personality tests and things like that. Are you going to be a good fit for a place like City? I think that became really important. Are you able to present a certain brand? And so again, using your time at LUMS to bolster some of those skills like communication, like confidence, like presentation. And so that's one part of it, to say why did a place like City take me? Because I think they realized that in addition to the GPA, there were a ton of other things, and we can talk about this a little later, but like, what other risks have you taken? What other stuff have you, what other portfolio have you built out? The novella I wrote with you, I think, was a key selling point, because it wasn't like the novella was something City was looking for, but it gives a signal that, is this someone who's willing to put in the hours? Is this someone who's got a certain discipline? And I think that's important to say, because we tend to think of it just in terms of the theory that we're learning, and I don't think it's only that. But the other thing that I think City did for me was that it debunked my myth of working at a corporation. All of that stuff of, oh, what will my contribution be? What will I... Yes, it may not allow you to change the world in the way that I was imagining it, but City was like a university. I mean, I met these brilliant leaders there. I had an astonishingly steep learning curve. And again, you realize those are things that will take me even when I'm writing a book later on, because there was a certain degree of professionalism, of discipline, of hard work that was required of you, which you then take to anything you do through life. And maybe this is something we'll touch later on in the conversation, but the other big thing it did for me was it introduced me to one out of two of the lifelong mentors that I have. Arif Osmani, who was the country head at the time for City and who went on to become the president of National Bank later. And in addition to yourself, he's the only other mentor I've really had through life. So, it's important to say that a lot of that jaded mindset I was going in with got debunked, and you realize that there are things you will learn in a corporation which will take you through life.
Excellent. So, I mean, it's a fascinating insight, and I think anyone who's listening would do well to really make notes on that. So, after Citibank, I think you went to Oxford, right? What was that like? Because now we moved from Karachi to LUMS, back to Citibank, and now you're going to one of the great universities in the world, and you went to do anthropology. So what was Oxford like?
Well, yeah, I mean, I should preface this part of the talk, of the conversation, just by saying that in large part, my desire and my pursuit to do anthropology stemmed from just being taught by you, watching, listening to your pedagogy, conversations we had, TAing for you, being exposed. That was my first exposure in life to anthropology. I'd never studied it before. I didn't know what the discipline encapsulated. And I'm saying that less as kind of to flatter you, but more to say this is the sort of stuff one can pick up during their time from LUMS. And even some years later, when you're making these other really crucial decisions, you realize. So I knew right after doing some classes with you and working with you, I was like, it's anthropology. And I think one of the big things that I wanted to pursue at Oxford, and the reason why I wanted to do anthropology, was that you had shown us during all of those classes on bonded labor, on witchcraft, I think one of the biggest things you showed us was the breadth of what anthropology can encapsulate. I could be going and doing field work on someone in a tiny village in Bahawalpur, and I could be studying nightlife in Dubai. And it's that entire stretch which really excited me. And so, as I was at City, I realized I don't want to leave a very large gap between my graduate studies, my postgrad, and my undergrad. And so I applied to Oxford and went ahead, pursued the social anthropology degree there, and it was obviously in many ways, even outside of the academic part of it, it was just like this beautiful enrichment program, just walking the streets of Oxford, right? And taking in so much, again, people from every walk of, not every walk of life, but just coming from so many parts of the world. And that was now a little bit different from LUMS, because LUMS had opened it up a little bit for me across Pakistan, and now suddenly we were talking to people from across the world, and all of that. But I think one of the things that my experience at Oxford did was it made me realize just how limited, और अब मैं कोई काफ़ी साल पहले की बात कर रही हूँ, so this has hopefully changed. But at that point, at that time, I do remember feeling this real stark vacuum of South Asian voice on a global platform. I felt when I was trying to research Pakistan, and I talked to people, and everyone clubbed it with India. And everything that people, sort of all the research people were quoting was coming out of India. And that spurred me on further to say, there need to be more of us who are actually carving out that space for Pakistani voices and things like that. So I think that became a real catalyst for me eventually when I wrote the book and things like that, to say, well, Pakistan there's overlap with India, but we need to have our own kind of space and voice and things like that. But apart from that, again, like just a very, very steep learning trajectory for me, just right from the personal statement, which I know I ran through you. There were so many drafts of it to say, how do you get into a place like Oxford, first of all? And so, yeah, I think it's been very special. But one of the things that I should say is that, again, this is why the alumni chat is it's such a beautiful space, because speaking of vulnerability and keeping it real, you realize that, I remember Abu had said this to me. He'd said, apply, Oxford, Cambridge for him were like, whether for better or for worse, like it meant you'd arrived in so many ways. And I said to him, Oxford? Like, I mean, are you serious? Why would I even try for this? And he said, well, इंसान के बच्चों को मिलता है, so the worst it'll be is that you'll get a rejection. And I think that's an important message to share with prospective graduate students now, to say, like, if you don't apply, you don't even give yourself that chance. And apply with everything you have. So, like, I remember my personal statement did so many rounds with you and me and, with a couple of other people. But eventually you give it that best shot. But I think stopping short of not even applying is perhaps, doing an injustice to yourself. And I think I didn't always think of it like that, but eventually came to it to say, all right, maybe, and if not, all right, I'm going to apply to SOAS and then XYZ and whatever. Yeah.
Well, I actually remember when you got in, it was a time of such pride and joy for all of us at LUMS also to see you get there. But I'm going to go back a little bit, like I said now, because I want to talk about this novella that you wrote called The Morning After. Yeah. And I recall that you did it as a senior project. And of course, the senior project was meant to be around 12,000 words. And of course, when we ended up with yours, it was 51,000 words. So, it was a long, long piece. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because I remember it as a beautifully written and actually quite complex novella. And really, for an undergraduate piece of work, it was astonishingly good. But I wanted to talk a little bit about that and linking it, of course, to, and then we can move to your, the huge achievement of writing a book, Skyfall. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, the novella for me is just one of the most, it's special, but it's also just so salient, right? Because every time I think about the novel now that I published, with Bloomsbury, and you feel like you're absolutely right, like obviously that feels like coming full circle and an achievement. But I think the seeds of Skyfall were sown when I wrote that novella, quite seriously. because it did a couple of things. And I suppose just to orient anyone who's listening, and you and I know this, but for me, there was this sense when the SPROG requirement came up, I was like, how do I use this mandatory requirement to graduate as something that I can take a little bit of a risk with, and as something that I can do which kind of pushes the envelope for me personally. Forget about whether it's impactful or not, but just kind of, can I prove something to myself which is beyond ticking the box of, oh, you completed an SSS proj? And so I remember thinking clearly in my head, I want to write a novella before I graduate, which may or may not be the best approach to things, but I felt like LUMS was a time of experimentation. I shouldn't be insincere and deny the fact that I was also someone very conscious of my GPA, something which I think I don't necessarily now want to pass on to my girls. I think you need to balance things. It's okay to have a C plus in an accounting class and not cry about it in the library, and it's something I didn't realize at the time. But with the novella, I think I realized I want, and this is something again going back to the School of Social Sciences, we talk so much about interdisciplinary stuff, about, not putting ourselves in these academic silos and things like that. I remember we would discuss this in courses, discuss it offline with faculty. And I was kind of coming at the novella from this approach of, what is the magic of marrying anthropology with creative writing or with literature? And I'd done these beautiful, powerful, compelling classes with Dr. Farooq Khan, as you know, and on partition and this. I said, let's just throw all of this in the mix. And you're very politely calling it complex. It was all quite obviously messy. I do think it was actually complex because all of that went into it. So that was one part of it, to say, all right, I want to take everything I've learned, anthropologically and in terms of creative writing and literature. And the other part of it was to say, do I have the discipline of writing 50 plus thousand words? And at that time I didn't know I was wanting to test myself for a novel, but I wanted to, because it takes a certain degree of pushing yourself and saying, I don't need to do it. I could get away with doing like 1/3 of that amount. And I suppose when that novella went through and later cut to, life after City, life in the Gulf, life at NYU, I think the novella really sowed those seeds. That was the first thing, and then there have been a couple of other very luminous moments, but I think that was really a key point to say, well, I've used my time at LUMS to take a risk, to do something. Again, it's very much coming from that sense of the growth mindset. Am I able to do this? Am I able to, and the other part of it, I suppose, also was that I thoroughly enjoyed anthropology and creative writing, and this was an opportunity to bring those two together.
Yeah.
And sorry, just before I finish that, I should say that again, and I'm sure you're not the only one, there must be other faculty as well doing this now, but so much of it was you saying, go ahead, do it. Like, that's all right, and this is where I feel like students need to come to faculty and say, and not feel that intimidation, to say, most likely a faculty member will spur you on and say, take a risk and I'll support you with it, and kind of ask for that help. So I think it's important to acknowledge that there was that support within the social sciences, because I'm not sure anyone had done it before, but to say, that's all right, it's experimental, but we'll do it anyway.
Yeah, I think that openness is something that was a hallmark of LUMS, and I think it continues to be so. But I wanted to move on from that to your experience with writing a book. So here you're writing a novella, which is part of your coursework. You've got to do it. You've decided, okay, that's fine. But when did you make the decision that you wanted to write a book? You wanted to write this book, Skyfall. What were the instances that led you to that, the inspirations? And then if you can take us through the process a little bit, because I think it's important for people to know, how much goes into something like this.
Yeah.
And of course, this is a very busy time for you personally as well. So, when did that happen?
Yeah, well, and you've probably heard this story ad nauseum, so I apologize if I'm repeating it to you, but I can't sort of relay my own story without going back to this little anecdotal snippet. But so we have the novella. I've got my growing up years where I'm like, okay, storytelling was very staple in our home and all of that. And so it wasn't a completely alien thought for me to say, all right, like I want to write, I want to tell a story. But so there were a series of these sorts of moments. And then, for a while I was a trailing partner with my husband, something I thought I'd never do. And I worked through that time, but, I followed him to the different geographies that his job took us. And eventually it brought us to NYU in the UAE. And obviously, that was a very charged environment. It was, again, it was this beautiful melting pot of people, but also of ideas. And, so I think the environment in that stage was absolutely ripe and set for me. And this was perhaps like I had given birth to our older daughter, and our younger daughter was about 3 weeks old. And I was sitting in a class at NYU, and we'd invited this gentleman who was the headmaster of a school in the UK, Sir Anthony Seldon. And he was talking to the students about mindfulness and about being immersed in the moment and just kind of all of this stuff. And he quoted Sir Henry David Thoreau, and this is not the exact quote, but it's a version of the quote that he sort of shared with the students. But the quote it kind of sealed my decision that morning of kind of where I was headed. And the quote, the kind of rehashed version of the quote was something like, most men and women lead lives of quiet desperation and go to the grave with the song still in them. And he said, take 5 minutes and scribble your song on a piece of paper and share it with the person sitting next to you. And I remember in that instant thinking, oh my goodness, like my song? What is my song? And it felt so daunting to have 5 minutes to conjure up something that felt so consequential. And I'm thinking, I've got these 2 small girls, I've got these pipe dreams, but I've got these girls, and there's a reality to how that sort of is an important facet. And I sort of have this very sensory, vivid memory of still just scribbling down my song. And I didn't write much, but I just said, storytelling is my song. And I shared it to the person who was sitting next to me. And with all of the other stew of influences and ingredients that we've talked about, this was the moment I think that really sealed my decision to say, all right, that morning I said, well, storytelling is my song, and that's a wonderful tagline. But I also decided that, I'm going to execute. Like, I'm going to put in the blood, sweat, and tears, which do, as you know very well, go into the making of a book. Because I think all too often we glamorize and glorify the idea of success. This idea of, I want to have my book on a bookstore, on a bookshelf, I want to be a published author. Of course you do, but that's the optics of it, and you realize like the craft and the process, as you asked me, is what's going to be 90% of it. And I think for me, that was a mental shift to say, all right, don't put the cart before the horse of wanting the published title, but rather go back and write those 300 pages first. And there's so much skepticism around people saying the prospects of a debut fiction novel getting published are pretty dismal. It's a very white publishing world, all of those sorts of things, which I think there's reality to. But the morning I heard the headmaster's words, sir, quite honestly, I went back home that night. I had a chat with my husband. I said, I realize there's 10 other things, 10 other directions I'm being pulled into, but this is something I want to do. I want to write my first novel. And again, this goes back to what I was saying about Oxford, that at least give it a shot. If I don't have the manuscript ready, I don't even stand a chance, really. So, you've quit and lost before it began. And I think that's something we all listen to a lot, but it takes a practical shift then to say, all right, I'm going to write every week, and then I'm going to get this edited and go through multiple rounds and take that criticism and all of that until it's something which feels like you could put in front of an agent. So I think that journey's been like a metamorphosis, really.
Yeah, yeah. And how long did it actually take you from start to finish?
It took me about 4 years. Yeah, four years, I would like to say, from start to 4 to 5. I mean, because I'd started sort of putting down little scribbles. So between 4 to 5 years, yeah.
It was a huge investment in time and an enormous effort, and it's been so well received that I'm sure you're extremely gratified with that. But so you've written a novel, you're lecturing, you're completing your PhD soon enough. You've made films, and we'll come back to a little bit of that. But also, very importantly, you're a mother to two lovely kids, and I think that's an enormous part of your life as well. So how did that change your life, your outlook, the rest of it? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, this is very similar to the question you asked me about my father, I suppose, because it's a question that's very close to my heart, as it is to every parent's heart. But I think it's changed me in so many ways. But more than the change, I suppose, I want to talk about the challenges, because the change is there, but again, part of the point of this conversation, I know, is also to share kind of the backstory, the backstage, to say, when what are the stumbling blocks that you come against, that you bump up against. And I think, and I'm sure you see this as well in the department, but when I see colleagues today who I am up against, not up against, but who I'm working with, who maybe don't have those demands and have a separate set of demands, I'm constantly in my head having this conversation of, oh my goodness, like, is this going to hold you back? Like, how will you compete? How will this? And I think motherhood has just made me realize that, and this is a little piece of advice I would now give to anybody, to realize that it's actually a marathon and not a sprint. And that sounds cheesy and it sounds like something you'd read on a billboard. But the reason why I say that is that it's made me realize, like, in the course of a 30, 40-year career, you've got to pace things out, and you've got to live life and approach life in kind of all its dimensions. And prior to, I think, parenthood, it was just this tunnel vision of go, 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 like especially Citibank did that to me, right? So I kind of didn't know a world outside the bank, and I'd have no time for whether it was my mother or my brother or whoever else. And, you sort of felt like everything was revolving around that. As a mother, I think I'm starting to realize that you can relish and feel enriched with all of these different facets, and life can be fulfilling and things can go in tandem. The challenge part of it, I would say, though, is that there are systemic biases. There are ceilings in place that make it difficult for people with different aspects of their identity. So this could be race for someone, it could be class for someone, it could be gender for someone. And I just feel like COVID, has really brought this kind of inequality into sharp focus. To say that the foundations on which gender equality rested are being questioned, because the bulk of the burden came on women. And I remember myself, like, the kids were running through the NYU Zoom classes, and their homeschooling, and my story is one of like so many. So I think there's work still to be done on that front, and I would be insincere if I denied that I find it very, very challenging to have a day job that is NYU, to have my passion and my song, which is the books, the films, the op-eds, and then to have these two glorious, beautiful children, and all of that coming together with pretty different, the ecology is comprised of very diverse and you know, very different facets, which don't always speak to each other very congruously. So I think there's no denying that it's very difficult. It's particularly difficult for women. Um, and again, with the book, that's why when if it took 5 years, you just got to make your peace with it and say, you know, that's how long it is going to take. And then it's a question of hopefully when rather than if. But I think it's very salient to who I am, and I can't really talk about my journey without confessing to how challenging the motherhood piece makes it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you articulated it so well, but you're right that there is still not a recognition of the multiple demands that are placed on female colleagues, on women, in terms of the many different lives that you live, and the many different demands that on a daily basis um, women all over the world are having to go through. Um, okay, so one of the areas that I know less about in terms of your career so far has been the filmmaking, and I wanted to know how we moved from writing to this different medium, and what it was that inspired you to take this side up. So if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, you know, I mean, let me allow me to back up just momentarily to say that when I rejoined City after Oxford, directly after Oxford, I was, and I say this not at all in a braggartish way, but just you to understand why I'm saying it, that I was 26 and I was on the management committee at City and kind of had leapfrogged into this very exciting role and, you know, really sucked my teeth into it. And, you know, it felt important, it felt great. And yet, as I went through the beats of life, I felt like what is still nudging at me? Why am I still not content? Why is this not feeling rewarding enough? And I suppose the question I would keep coming back to was how, you know, I'm someone who's always had this desire to lead a life which is beyond myself, and also which in some ways can touch someone else's life. It doesn't have to be like shifting the world in this macro way, but just how do you live for your eulogy along with your resume, you know? And that's something that's always been on my mind. How do you make a meaningful contribution? So that's why when I spoke to you about discovering the song, storytelling was like the broad stroke brush of it, right? Like so much came under it. And writing was the most organic thing that I leapt to, because it's what I knew, it's what I'd seen in my home, it's what I'd not trained in, but I'd done it enough to know that, you know, I could give this a shot. And as I thought a little more about storytelling, I kind of thought, a story is a story agnostic to the medium. What's my motivation to tell this story? It's the ability to be able to touch someone's life, even if that's the life of like two people, it doesn't matter. And that's when I started realizing that it operates agnostic to medium. And I could be sitting around a campfire and telling a story, and it could move somebody, and it could shift them in some way, because I think it's almost like you're inviting someone for a walk, or you're inviting someone for a dance, in a sense. And so that's when I realized, even though obviously, and you and I have had this conversation, you know, recently in this over the summer, that, you know, with social media, obviously everything's very instant and it's very like diminishing focus times and concentration spans. But and as much as like that worries me, but I also did realize that visual storytelling has this very instant connect. Like even when I'm consuming stuff, of course, like there are some of us who still enjoy reading and things like that, but I was able to reach out at a much larger scale with something like a documentary, with something like a short film. And so, you know, I thought, so the medium was very attractive to me. And I was in Doha, as I said, trailing my husband, at that time looking for work. It's like, oh my God, I'm going to tear my own hair out and his, so I better do something. And again, I'd always wanted to experiment with filmmaking. And I said, all right, you know what? I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to put in a grant to the Doha Film Institute. Put in everything I had into that. You know, it's the story, as you know, of like these street child footballers in Karachi who went on to win bronze for Pakistan in the Street Child World Cup. And it was a story that moved me. Again, going back to the SS part of it, of LUMS, I was thinking to myself, I want to tell a story that dismantles this impression of Pakistan. You know, that acknowledges the problem of 1.5 million street children, but that leaves you with a bit of optimism and says sport is transformational in many ways. And I know I'm completely preaching to the converted here. So, that's where it came from. And I just literally got a couple of people I knew, picked up the camera, and we were on this out in Liari in Karachi filming. And I have to say, it was an absolute treat. You know, I'm on to my next project now. And I think it's something that excites me perhaps the most in everything I do.
Well, I know we're coming up to the hour, but I actually wanted to ask you, so what does the future hold?
Yeah, well, the future holds the kids, the girls. You know, obviously that's a big part of it. But professionally speaking, so I've started now with pre-production for the next documentary. And, it's obviously it's at a very embryonic stage, but what I should say, I suppose, is that it's about this rising hip hop and rap scene in Pakistan, and music kind of being this leveler again in some ways, or kind of being um, showing you a world where coexistence is the currency. So I think that's something that I'm working on, and very, very excited about. And I think at the same time, I'm in talks with my agent for the next nonfiction piece. So, we're kind of, but again, speaking of pacing it out in marathons and sprints, so I'm in the process of now working on the next nonfiction book, which deals with South Asian feminism.
Okay, well, I mean, it's lovely to see that. I think that the impact of anthropology stays with you in terms of the work on sport and on culture and all of that. So that's wonderful. But so any advice for alumni, colleagues of yours, current students that hopefully are listening in on us at the moment as well? What would your advice be?
Yeah, always a tough one, right? Because you're thinking like, who the heck am I to give anyone? But when I think about your question, I feel like I think about it a little differently now, because sometimes giving advice can feel like patronizing and condescending, but I do feel like I wish there were a few things I knew at the time, like 15 years ago, which I think if one passes on can be helpful. So, thanks for that question. I feel like, maybe a couple of quick things. One thing that my time at LUMS and then subsequently through my work journey so far has taught me, and this is especially for students listening in, that take your time at LUMS and then in the early years of your career to seek out mentors and role models. And the reason why I say that is I feel mentorship is so badly misunderstood. I feel people see it as this kind of speed dating, just like let's network here, a little schmooze there, and never speak to the person again until you need a job from them or until you need a recommendation letter. And I think my time during and after LUMS, this is something that I've really had top of my mind. I have two mentors through my journey today. One is yourself, and one is, Arif Osmani, who I mentioned to you, who was president of NPP just previously. And the reason why I think this is important advice is that, especially for current Luminites, is that take your time at LUMS to at least build that one meaningful relationship with a faculty member, with someone from admin, with whoever it might be. Knock on their doors. We were recently having this conversation with students at NYU to say, you don't need to come to an office hour just with a course related question. You can come introduce yourself, talk about what's on your mind. Sometimes people will come to us and say, I need a recommendation, and you're thinking, well, who are you? And so it's with those little things that you realize don't show up at the time that you need something from someone. I feel very, very strongly about this, and I feel like these are people who will help you navigate this terrain of finding your song, of kind of discovering. They're going to be honest critics. I mean, who can I say this more than to you? Where every stage of life up until now, I've always kind of sent you that email, that message to say, asking for help. I think just normalizing asking for help. But again, doing it in a way that's a little more meaningful as opposed to, let me come to you when I need you. And I think mentoring requires that you ask for help, but you also listen in and you invest in that. And I think that's where it becomes meaningful. So almost for people to say, I'll take my 4 years to at least embed myself in one or two such relationships, because God knows, and my journey is a testament to it, that it serves you through life. So I think that's one thing. And perhaps the only other last thing that I would say is that, again, like, I feel like I'm trying to say this kind of tactfully, but this idea of today, and I think it was there even when I was at LUMS, that, when I joined City, fresh off the boat, there was this self-importance, this sense of, oh my God, like the world, this is the world. And, on day one, everybody wants to be walking out of their job with a Mercedes, and everyone's looking to kind of leapfrog. And I did the same thing where I felt like, oh my God, how do I just catapult quickly up this ladder? And I eventually feel like it's a jungle gym. It's not a ladder. Like, you're not looking up the same flight of stairs the whole time. And this is why I feel like pacing it out, not doing it at the expense of every other relationship. Eventually becoming a mother made me realize that. I think it's important to look at that in 3D. And the reason why I said this thing about walking in feeling like I should drive a Mercedes out the first day or become a director or a managing director, I think that comes from a space of very dangerous entitlement and a lack of humility, an absolute lack of humility, which I see a lot around me in young people today. It's an unfortunate thing to say, but I say this very genuinely, that I think that needs to change. To say, my husband, a boss once said to my husband, in the early parts of your career, if someone says mop a floor, do it really well, but do it. And so the point kind of being to shed some of that entitlement and just to say, I'm going to approach this job with humility, and I've got 30, 40 years ahead of me. Hopefully, that takes you through life and, I think feels more rewarding and just feels like you've lived a much more multi-dimensional existence. So I think and again, who am I to say that? But that's just been my little nuggets that I think I'm still working with as a mantra through life.
Well, Saba, thank you so much for not only this last piece of advice, but being the easiest and most articulate interviewee that I could possibly have hosted. I didn't need to do very much. So it's been a real pleasure having you. I certainly, speaking for myself, but also other colleagues who have taught you at LUMS, remain extremely proud of everything that you've achieved and wish you all success going forward. Thank you again from our side. And I hope to see you back at LUMS at some point in person.
Thank you so much. Really, I mean, I knew speaking at any platform with LUMS would be special, but I think you're well aware of exactly how poignant it is that, you were my interlocutor. So thank you so much to you and to LUMS, and I hope to see you in Lahore soon.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you, Sabah.
All right.